When you visit South Africa today, you'll probably fly into either Johannesburg or Cape Town. As you drive through either of these capital cities at the southern tip of Africa, an unsettling sight is guaranteed to meet your eyes as you drive through the urban areas. There are miles and miles of tin huts and shacks outside of these major cities where 12.5 million black South Africans live today and have for many decades. These areas are primarily known in South Africa as townships. Under apartheid law, black South Africans were forced out of white-only urban residential areas and required to live in townships, sometimes just outside of the city, and many times miles and miles away from the cities where they worked. The mere fact that millions of black South Africans still live in relatively the same conditions they did under apartheid, which ended more than 30 years ago, reflects the dire reality of South Africa's failure to do away with brutal oppression against non-white people. To the outside world, the end of South Africa's apartheid government in 1994 was supposed to signal a new era of cooperation and human rights. Instead, due to corruption and reformism in the ANC, also known as the African National Congress, and due to the same sorry contradictions of capitalism, a new era of economic apartheid has been ushered in, where the same racial divisions exist in South Africa, now through economic means rather than legalized racial oppression. In order to discuss South Africa's major issues today, it is important to first understand apartheid, a system of institutional racial segregation that defines the violent history of the country. The word apartheid comes from the Afrikaans language, meaning separateness or the state of being apart. Afrikaans is a language spoken primarily in southern African countries that evolved from Dutch and was spoken by white Dutch settlers in the region. Throughout the history of apartheid, Afrikaans was forcefully taught to school children of all races, and it quickly became a language seen as oppressive and racist by non-whites. When official apartheid policies were first established in South Africa in 1948, with parliament under control of the National Party, all of South Africa's people were segmented into four different racial groups. Black, consisting of mainly indigenous African people; Indian, the descendants of migrants from India who arrived during the 19th and 20th century; colored, which is known as an offensive term in the United States, and I'm sure some folks might feel it's offensive in South Africa as well, but was an official group under apartheid known to refer to multiracial people; and white, mainly descendants of Dutch and British settlers. Settlers of Dutch origin are commonly referred to as Afrikaners. This group dominated apartheid politics for decades. Privileges varied between each racial group, with white people having virtually no restrictions on their human rights, outside of those imposed on the white working class by the white ruling class, and with black people having the most restrictions on their rights. I will now recount some of apartheid's worst crimes against non-white South Africans. Politics and voting. Non-whites did not have the right to vote in elections or participate in the formal political process. Land ownership. 87% of South Africa's land was legally designated for white people, with the remaining 13% set aside as the Bantustans, which was an Afrikaans word used to delineate the land designated for all non-whites. Keep in mind that throughout apartheid, the white population of South Africa was only around 13% of the total demographic, with non-whites making up the majority, meaning that the vast minority of the population were given the overwhelming 87% of the land, including the best farmland. The Bantustans were widely known to be the worst farmland in the country and were generally poverty-stricken rural areas. Citizenship. Many attempts were made to designate the Bantustans as independent territories and to strip citizenship from all non-whites and to designate them as foreigners in their own country. Forced removal. When the white ruling class decided they no longer wanted non-whites living in a particular area, they would simply force them to move with the use of police and military, utilizing tactics like bulldozing their homes and burning them to the ground. This may remind you of Israel's treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Restricted movement. The non-white working class were often forced to travel many miles from the rural Bantustans into the white urban areas in order to work. Brutal restrictions were imposed on non-whites traveling into white areas, such as pass laws, wherein all non-whites had to keep a passbook that declared their legal right of where and when they were allowed to be employed. Millions of people were arrested and punished for violations of the pass law during the apartheid era. In addition to the pass law, banning as a form of silencing was very common. If a person was banned in South Africa, this meant their very existence was essentially illegal. Banning laws were intentionally vague, and both a person or an organization could be banned. For a person, this typically meant they were confined to a specific area, meaning restriction of movement, as well as restriction from publishing statements, working, and more. This was a common tactic used by the apartheid government against political protesters and activists. Suppression of protests and free speech. Under laws such as the Public Safety Act, the Suppression of Communism Act, the Unlawful Organization Act, the Terrorism Act, and the Internal Security Act, any speech, organizing, or protest against apartheid was strictly forbidden and illegal. Many thousands of people were arrested and killed by police over the course of decades for daring to oppose brutal racial oppression. There was no First Amendment or right of freedom to speech in South Africa. And finally, detention and jailing. Habeas corpus did not exist in apartheid South Africa. Jailing and detention did not require a reason and could go on indefinitely. Torture, solitary confinement, and death while in detention were common for political prisoners. The policies of apartheid violently oppressed South Africa's majority racial groups for decades and inspired violent and nonviolent resistance. One notable anti-apartheid activist was Steve Biko, famous for pioneering the Black consciousness movement. Through the organization he founded, SASO, the South African Student Organization, he developed his ideology based on the idea that for Black South Africans to break the shackles of apartheid, they first needed to break the shackles in their own minds. Biko emphasized African nationalism and believed that the movement against apartheid needed to be Black and that white liberals were not welcome to organize together with non-whites. He argued that a system like apartheid was so pervasive that it had infiltrated the minds of the oppressed, to the point many of them did not believe it was possible to fight against it, stating, quote, "The greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed," unquote. At the age of 30, Biko was beaten to death by South African police after testifying for several days on behalf of his fellow political activists in a state trial against them. The most famous South African anti-apartheid activist was Nelson Mandela, also known by his clan name Madiba. He was born into a traditional Xhosa village in a rural area of the Cape Province. Being a member of the royal family of his village, he was fortunate enough to seek an education and study to become a lawyer. Being the only Black student at Wits University in Johannesburg, he experienced racism and became involved in activism and political work. Early in his political career, Mandela embraced African nationalism and the idea that non-whites and whites could not work together to defeat apartheid. He soon joined the ANC and within a short amount of time became a founder of their youth wing. At this time, Mandela regularly disavowed communism and at one point supported a vote to remove any non-blacks and communists from the ANC Youth League. In 1950, when a May Day general strike was called, Mandela and the ANC abstained due to the strike being multiracial and for the fact that the ANC was not the one leading the protest. With a majority of Black workers attending the event, the ANC missed a huge chance to connect with the Black working class. Their abstention from this type of event would be a precursor to future failures. Soon after this monumental failure, Mandela would do a 180 and embrace a multiracial movement against apartheid and would welcome communists within the movement as well. He spent time studying Marxism and read Marx and Lenin and non-Marxists such as Mao. While Mandela did ultimately become a leader in the South African Communist Party, he never truly embraced communism as his leading ideology in opposing apartheid. Mandela stated, quote, "The breaking up and democratization of these banking, mining, and land monopolies will open up fresh fields for the development of a prosperous non-European bourgeois class. For the first time in the history of this country, the non-European bourgeoisie will have the opportunity to own, in their own name and right, mines and factories, and trade and private enterprise will boom and flourish as never before," unquote. Mandela never believed that capitalism was the reason for apartheid, or that it was necessary to end capitalism to seek true racial justice. Mandela became one of the world's most famous political prisoners when he was arrested in 1962 and received a life sentence for sabotage and attempting to overthrow the government. He ultimately spent 27 years in prison for daring to fight against apartheid. He was primarily held along with other political prisoners at Robben Island, a small island off the coast of Cape Town. During his time in prison, he was physically harassed, subjected to solitary confinement, had his mail censored, was not permitted regular visits with his wife or children, at times slept on a bed made of rocks, was not allowed to speak with his fellow prisoners, and was forced to perform hard labor. I'll discuss more about his release later. Opposition to apartheid consisted of hundreds of organizations throughout the country with varying ideologies. Today, I'll discuss the efforts of the ANC as well as the SACP, the South African Communist Party, to resist apartheid while preserving capitalism. Prior to the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, when police massacred protesters who were demonstrating against past laws, the ANC relied on nonviolent tactics such as strikes and boycotts to disrupt the flow of business as usual. As membership grew, they organized mass civil disobedience campaigns in opposition to apartheid laws. After Sharpeville, the ANC and many other anti-apartheid organizations were officially banned by the South African government, meaning it was illegal for the organization to exist or for anybody to be a member. With financial and military support from the Soviet Union, the paramilitary wing of the ANC named MK, also known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation in Xhosa, was born. The MK utilized guerrilla violence, such as sabotage and bombings, to push the ruling class or attempt to push the ruling class towards an end to apartheid. And like the ANC, were forced to operate from outside of South Africa entirely during this period. After their banning, the ANC and MK operated in secret for several decades as a new relationship with the SACP began. The SACP, the Communist Party, received funding support from the Soviet Union and were openly Stalinist in their policies and their stance towards the end of apartheid. Their analysis claimed that apartheid in South Africa was CST, or colonialism of a special type. Their view was that South Africa's indigenous workers were a black colony to their white oppressors, and only colonialism needed to be overthrown to end apartheid, not capitalism. The SACP incorrectly stressed that socialism would come at a later stage after the overthrow of apartheid. With the ANC's newfound relationship with the SACP, they gained cover from criticism from the left. If the left stated that the ANC did not focus enough on the plight of the working class, they could simply point to their flimsy relationship with the SACP. Whereas in reality, the ANC had no interest in overthrowing capitalism, only in installing a new black bourgeoisie to go along with the current all-white ruling class. Stalinist authoritarianism grew within the two organizations, to the point where any working class or union-led action against apartheid that wasn't directly led by those two organizations was not only not embraced, but directly shunned. Members and leaders within the organization that did not toe the party line were shamed, expelled, and even had violence used towards them. In 1990, due to intense international diplomatic and economic pressure, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and the ANC and other illegal organizations were unbanned by the apartheid government. The ANC had been pushing for a simpler end to apartheid for decades. Their militant and non-militant struggles alike were simply methods towards future enrichment and to push their own party leaders into positions of power. The ANC embraced neoliberalism in their efforts to negotiate the end of apartheid with South Africa's capitalist class and the National Party in control of parliament. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, any excuse to maintain an organizational preference towards nationalism of industries or communist ideology was dropped. While the United States and other Western countries officially recognized Mandela and the ANC as terrorists, behind closed doors, they urged the apartheid government to negotiate with the ANC in order to ensure the preservation of capitalism, and in turn, South Africa's lucrative industries like diamond and emerald mining. The ANC and SACP both recognized that mass action was needed in order to ensure the negotiations to end apartheid would succeed. However, they also recognized that creating a mass movement from the working class would be inconvenient if they were to take power as new members of the capitalist class. Ultimately, the first democratic elections in South Africa were held in 1994, with the ANC winning a near two-thirds majority in parliament. They have held the same control of parliament for the last 3 decades. Over the years, they began to install their own party leaders and loyalists into high-level positions within the government, as well as giving favorable deals to business leaders if they were to enrich ANC leadership. This began the decades of corruption within the South African government that we still see today. Any present day South African can tell you that everyone is aware that the ANC is hilariously corrupt. While a black capitalist class has begun to emerge, the vast majority of the country's wealth is still owned by the white capitalist class, with ANC loyalists installed in positions of power in many of their business enterprises. The non-white working class are still in the same economic position today, because the conditions of their oppression changed only on a racial level, not a class one. It is important to note that apartheid South Africa's closest international ally was Israel. From 1967 onward, after Israel's Six-Day War and their subsequent occupation of the Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank, South Africa and Israel began diplomatic and military collaboration that grew stronger over the decades. Much of South Africa's white population admired the Israeli colonization and brutal genocide against the Palestinians. We can only deduce that they wanted to see the same violence towards the indigenous people of their own country. South African and Israeli UN delegations would regularly abstain from votes in order to aid each other in continuing their racist policies, kind of like the United States and Israel today. Israel regularly delivered military aid to South Africa as it fought proxy wars in Angola and Zimbabwe in an attempt to ensure white rule continued in their neighboring nations as well. It is even alleged that the two nations collaborated on nuclear missile testing. Ultimately, these two countries saw their colonization against indigenous peoples as very similar and worked together to ensure the survival of each of their violent ideologies. When the 1913 Native Lands Act was passed, even prior to apartheid, land ownership by South Africa's non-white population was restricted to around 10% of the total land mass of the country. Even sharecropping was forbidden for non-whites on farmland with this new law. This essentially meant that land that was previously tilled and maintained by the indigenous population for generations was ripped away from them and suddenly handed to white people. And for those that subsisted by sharecropping or tenant farming, they were forced into wage labor. An immediate socioeconomic crisis was created where large portions of the non-white population were forced into poverty, where a lack of strong education ensured there would be no change in the racial order. When the end of apartheid was achieved, the ANC expressed a desire to return indigenous land to its rightful owners in the form of compensation or restitution. However, as of 2018, only 10% of indigenous land has been returned to its ancestral owners. This leads us to the discussion currently happening within the Trump administration on quote unquote white genocide in South Africa. To South Africans, this talking point is nothing new. Farm attacks are attacks on farms owned by white people, which typically involve robbery, home invasion, and murder. These attacks are known to make up less than 1% of the murder rate within South Africa annually. However, the South African right has latched onto the narrative in a play to regain racial power over the non-white population of South Africa. This narrative has been pushed by the conservatives and Afrikaners in South Africa since the end of apartheid. These types of white supremacist conspiracy theories are similar to the type of violent rhetoric that capitalist politicians in the US utilize against migrants at the southern border. Racists like Trump and Elon Musk jump on the bandwagon to spearhead these narratives from South Africa in order to push their own white nativist policies in the United States. This is why they made such a big show of bringing supposed white South African refugees to the US. In conclusion, bourgeois liberalism, not Marxism, was used to end apartheid in South Africa. When the nations of the capitalist world collectively came together and said enough was enough and that apartheid in South Africa could not continue, the ANC paved their way into a balancing act where they could simultaneously end racial apartheid just enough to become a part of the ruling class themselves, but preserve capitalism in order to keep the dominant power structures in place. Non-white people in South Africa still suffer majorly today at the hands of the ruling class in their country. While we can recognize the struggle of South Africa's civil rights leaders, such as Nelson Mandela and many others, that did not survive to see the end of apartheid, we can also clearly state their failure to see that preserving capitalism and emphasizing a black bourgeoisie meant preserving the same system that apartheid thrived under. Apartheid wasn't a special system outside of capitalism. It was simply the form capitalism took at the southern tip of Africa. Insisting on not fighting a class war, but only a racial war instead, has led to the miserable conditions for non-white South Africans today. We can use the lessons of South Africa to advance our knowledge of how to navigate struggles against oppression. The apartheid and genocide the Palestinians experience at the hands of Israel is a direct example. We shouldn't fight just to end racial, ethnic, religious, or other types of discrimination, which are symptoms of an oppressive class society, but we should choose instead to fight the big fight, the one against capitalism that has perpetuated these divisions across the world for hundreds of years. We need to tear bigotry, exploitation, racism, and all forms of oppression out at their root. And the only way to do this is to fight capitalism itself.